Welcome to Military Faith and Spiritual Resilience. This is Elizabeth Fulgaro. With me is Erin Nichols, nutritional and fitness coach and Gold Star wife. Hi, Erin.
Hi, Elizabeth.
You've been so good to continue your story with us, and I'm excited for you sharing more about your journey and Sam's journey and where God was in it and just where life has taken you. So, the last episode when we finished, you had arrived at rehab. So here we have your wonderful husband who you weren't sure would live, and he's been making progress. And now you're at the VA in Palo Alto. Please share more about your time there, and then what happened after that.
So the beginning of rehab was kind of stalled because of a pretty serious wound to his left buttock. So I mentioned before the corpsman who always came in. If she came in, it was something painful. Well, he had that wound on his left buttock, and in order to change that dressing, he had chest tubes on the right side because he had punctured his lungs and there was fluid. So ideally, in order to get to the left butt cheek, you roll to the right. But we couldn't roll to the right because we had these double chest tubes there. So you could only roll him to the left, which meant you had to roll him very far to his left. It took a lot of doing in order to get to that. And when we were in Palo Alto, it was still very much there. And just because of where it was, you don't want to have pressure on that. So it wasn't a pressure wound like you'd get like a bed sore, but it kind of acted like that. It was a blast wound, but it had to be healed before they were able to get him into a wheelchair. So the first kind of major obstacle, besides we began to fight chronic UTIs, urinary tract infections, the next big obstacle was getting that wound healed so that they can get him in the wheelchair and really progress his rehab. So we had a whole team working on getting this taken care of. So at that time, and it's different now, but at the time, the polytrauma unit, which is where he was right next door to the spinal cord injury unit. And in spinal cord injury, it's very common to have pressure wounds, and they had their own wound care nurse. So it wasn't as common on the polytrauma unit to have that type of wound to deal with. And so we were having to rely on the purple lady. I don't remember what her name was, but she was known as the purple lady because she always wore purple, and like that was her shtick. And everything was kind of retroactive a little bit, and she was having to she had an entire caseload, and then just to go to the other unit. And so, but she basically ended up training some of the physical therapists and some of the rehab RNs to take care of this. So we had pulse lavage and e-stim and wet to dry dressings and the wound vac and all these things. There's this whole progression. I learned a lot about wound care in this process. He had a special bed that's actually, it actually reminds me of a slip and slide. The way that it's made, there was a slip and slide, and then there was like a little pool at the end of it. So it reminded me of the pool at the end. So there's the upper piece, if you imagine a hospital bed where the head raises and lowers, that upper piece was separate from the rest of kind of the body of the bed. So that when he's lying in it, there's this bumper kind of that goes all the way around the edge of it. And then the inside, there's this sheet thingy on top, and underneath it's all these little silicone beads, and then this warm air flows, and so the silicone beads are constantly moving, so you're never really on the same spot, no pressure in any
That's
in any
really
spot.
clever.
And the warm air also helps with healing. And so we had the special beds, we had all these things, but the only therapy he could do at the time had to be done in his room, in his bed, because we couldn't get him into a wheelchair. So when we finally got to the point, I want to say it was 3 months before we finally got to the point where we were able to get him into a chair. And he didn't have any clothes yet, and he just had the hospital gown.
Oh, poor guy.
So we have pictures somewhere of him, and they got him on this special type of bike that has a motor, and they actually strap your feet into it, and the motor will help basically take the patient's legs through the range of motion, and then the hope is that their muscles will start to kick in. So that was like the first kind of big momentous thing that happened there in Palo Alto. And then, we just continued on with therapy there, and he kind of reached a point where it was going to be time to move on. It was only supposed to be 3 months there, but because of the wound issue, it ended up being 6 months. So then we ended up going to Kentfield Rehab in Marin County. So that's basically the other side of the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco. Amazing place to be and to live, and a very generous nurse and doctor were a married couple there at the hospital, and they let me live in a studio apartment over their garage in like one of the most exclusive areas in all of Marin County, which is saying something. Lars Ulrich of Metallica was our neighbor. Robin Wright Penn lived about 200 yards from the hospital where Sam was. So it's kind of a fancy place. And the hospital itself was not fancy. The area that we were in was fancy. They've now renovated, and it is much better. But the people and just the caliber of doctors and therapists who were there were fantastic. And he made a lot of progress there. We had this amazing, brilliant doctor, Dr. Doherty. She was a physiatrist, a physical medicine and rehab doctor. So she was basically a TBI, a traumatic brain injury doctor. And she particularly excelled in neuropharmacology. So medicine that will help a brain injury, will help someone to emerge from this, become more awake, essentially, and improve their cognition. And he made a lot of strides there. In speech and communication, in his ability to move. We did lots of physical therapy. We invented a therapy. We invented kiss therapy. So
I want to know about that.
Yeah. So it was very hard for him to keep his head up. And so his head would always be down, like chin on his chest kind of thing, which is not good for his neck. It's going to stretch out the muscles at the back of the neck, and you need to be able to lift his head up to talk, to swallow, all these things. And so during therapy, we'd get him in position, and they'd tell him to, pick your head up, Sam, look up. And then I would come over and like, give me a kiss. Bam, his head would pop up.
Oh, awesome.
So we would, and then, the therapist would use that, and that continued basically for the rest of his life, kiss therapy. Eventually, I think he just started sandbagging. I'm just gonna wait for the kiss offer before I lift my head up. So yeah, it was about a year and a half of rehab. We actually went back to Palo Alto for like 2 more months. To kind of get any extra services. We ended up getting a power wheelchair at that point, kind of a last little tune-up before we went essentially home. So we're from the Sacramento area, the suburbs of Sacramento, and we ended up at this really amazing rehab home called Care Meridian. And it is no longer called Care Meridian. It's called something that I can't remember. Neuro, I think, is part of it, but it's like not ringing a bell at the moment. But Care Meridian is where we ended up, and it was this beautiful, at the time, only 6-bed subacute rehab home. And home is the operative word there.
Okay.
So it is like the legal classification for it is a congregated living facility, and by state law, you can't have more than 16 or 18 beds. It is more of a home-like atmosphere than like a skilled nursing facility. And there's a higher staff-to-patient ratio that's regulated by the law, and how many patients you have to have a certain amount of staff to cover. And it was in a beautiful location. So there was a pond in the backyard, this big green, huge green back lawn that kind of went down this hill to this big pond. And then, there's like trees and tall grasses and everything all the way around the pond, fountain in the middle, lily pads, the ducks and geese would come in. And then we were essentially like surrounded by ranches.
How beautiful.
Yeah.
What a beautiful setting.
Yeah. So, we would go outside, a really nice covered patio too in the back. And so we go outside and read and hang out, be in the fresh air, go visit the horses next door, look at the pigs, whatever. And it was a really great place too for the family to be able to come and congregate, and all that. And then there was really low turnover too there, which was really important because the staff, the nurses, the CNAs, the therapists, they knew him so well. And I mean, they were really family. And I could start to pull back a little bit. It took a while. But because they got to know him so well and could anticipate his needs, could understand how to communicate with him, I was able to leave a little bit and know that he was going to be okay. I knew
Super
that he was happier
important.
when I was there, but I finally got to the point where I needed to be able to pull back a little bit and take care of me.
So let's put this in perspective. We have a miracle that he comes out of this coma. We have a miracle that he's able to move somewhat, that he's recovering from his injuries, that he didn't pass away.
Mm-hmm.
But what was the condition then that he was in? Because he wasn't able to live at home.
Right. So he needed 24-hour nursing care. He pretty much all the way from very back in Bethesda, he was very prone to infections, especially by the time we got to Kentfield. Urinary tract infections were constant. We tried all sorts of different things, methods of, elimination, and whatever we did, he was colonized. So he basically had like the super bugs that you hear about that we don't want to become like normal. Like he had all the super bugs, and if you didn't have them to begin with, he ended up with them later. C. diff, which was pretty much the only like bad bug that he never got, and he had bad bugs that most people have never heard about. And so, like, we were very, very well known by the infectious disease doctors, especially at Kentfield and Marin General and at Sutter Roseville, our local hospital in our hometown area. But as far as him goes, he was very much him at this point. Like, he knew who I was. He was pretty content as long as he was kind of entertained and comfortable. He was pretty content, and he could understand everything that was happening, but he had no short-term memory. So part of having a right hemisphere brain injury, which is primarily what he had, is denial of injury. And it's not denial. It's more like oblivious to injury or the level of deficit that you have. So for the most part, he just thought everything was fine. And then because he had no short-term memory, he also couldn't track time. And so he usually thought that we were like 16-ish, like between 16 to 19
wow.
or so.
Yeah.
So he asked me to be his girlfriend pretty frequently.
That is really sweet.
Yeah. Proposed multiple times. I would ask him, you want to do this or whatever, or let's do this. And he's like, I can't, I have to go to class, or I have to ask my mom, or whatever, because he usually thought that we were 16. Communication though was difficult. So he was able to communicate these things to me, but and kind of the beginning of my speech language pathology career actually was when we were still in Palo Alto, and we were trying to establish some sort of reliable communication with him. And he developed this tremor in his right hand. So it turns out he had Parkinsonism. So the area of the brain, the basal ganglia, where Parkinson's disease happens, was one of the areas that had one of those pinpoint areas of damage, of trauma. And so he had symptoms of Parkinson's. He just didn't have the disease process. So it started with just his right index finger, and it would just like move back and forth. And then he had also had where his entire forearm would basically move. So it was almost like he's pumping his bicep all day long. He had really shiny fingernails, especially his index finger, because it was like constantly being rubbed against his shirt. So he was just buffing them basically all day long. And so he's doing the finger thing, and his brother jokingly said, "Sam, what number are you?" And he held it as a 1.
Oh, wow.
And then I said, "What number is Donnie?" And he held out 2 fingers. And so I like, okay, that we can use that for yes and no. And so I started asking him some yes or no questions. And it has to be like known things. Like, is your middle name Evan? 1 for yes, 2 for no.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Is your first name Brian? 1 for yes, 2 for no. No. So we would like start asking him these things, and it'd have to help with it took some trial and error and everything, but like, okay, we have something. I ran down the hall and grabbed a speech therapist, and that was the beginning of it. When we were in Kentfield and we had that amazing doctor, physiatrist, Dr. Doherty, he started to speak a little bit, but he basically couldn't turn on his voice, or he couldn't volitionally turn on his voice.
Okay.
So when he would go to speak, it would be a whisper. And he had weak muscles in his mouth and tongue. And so there were certain sounds that he just couldn't make or were difficult to make because of that lack of motor control. So this got better and better over the years, and certainly I ended up going back to school to become a speech therapist. I got my bachelor's and then my master's degree in that. And as I was learning more and more about him, and then able to apply things to him. And we were able to use that to help improve his communication. And just as he was just spontaneously healing, things got better. And there were some days that were like really good verbal days, other days not so much. It could be, half a day would be great and the other half not so much. All sorts of variables there. But he could communicate relatively well. He was a really good speller. And so what we would do is, because there were those sounds that were really difficult and often his voice wasn't even on, I would have him just spell one word, one letter at a time, spell whatever it is. We also use like an alphabet board. He just wanted to talk though. So he would get impatient with it. And he also had, because of the tremor and everything, he didn't have great motor control over his arm, and so like that frustrated him. But there's one thing, just like an idea of just kind of where he was cognitively, like how there he was cognitively. We're just sitting in his room, commercial comes on for a Gillette razor. It has this pivoting head, so as you're shaving your face, the actual head of the razor kind of moves a little bit with the structure, of your face. And he says, "I need that maneuverability."
Oh my goodness.
And I couldn't understand maneuverability. He had to spell it out for me, which he was an excellent speller and he spelled it correctly. Took a while to get that. And also like context made a big difference. And as far as me figuring out what he was saying, and I had no idea what he was talking about. And then I finally put it together. So I got him that razor for, his birthday or Christmas or whatever. That's actually the razor I use now.
Is it?
Yeah, it sits in my shower. And every time when I'm going over my knee, it's like, I need that maneuverability. But yeah, he was, I think, despite the fact that he had infection after infection after infection, spent a lot of time in the hospital. He also didn't remember those times.
That's actually a real blessing for him.
Yeah, definitely. And it was rare that he would be kind of like depressed or mopey or just in a bad way. For the most part, he had a really good quality of life. And when I wasn't there, he had his therapies that went on during the day, and the staff, took great care of him, and they'd put him out by the nurse's station or whatever, especially if they knew, like, if I was traveling or something, which I didn't do a lot of. but they would make sure that he was, entertained or whatever, and all that. And yeah, we had a really good last. It was like 11 years. It was just shy of 11 years that we were there at Camp Meridian.
It's wonderful, the quality of life, the place that you ended up, and the balance that you found, and the love that just continued to really thrive
Yeah.
between the two of you. Let's continue next time.